Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Hamilton West-Ancaster-Dundas.
Mr. Speaker, today I will be splitting my time with the Honourable Member from Vaughan-Woodbridge. I am honoured to give my maiden speech on Bill C-4, a bill that re-establishes a productive balance between unions and employers. I represent the riding of Hamilton West-Ancaster-Dundas, where many proud union brothers and sisters reside, work, and prosper together. The building trades, teachers, electricians, labourers, police, steelworkers, carpenters, and many others work to build our prosperous and peaceful city through their ingenuity and their stubborn belief and hard work, which should be rewarded with fair wages, safe working conditions, and equality of opportunity. These are the values, Mr. Speaker, that I grew up with. Unions were a big part of my life and my family's life for the last 2 generations. I am the daughter of a proud steelworker. My father, Phil Tassi, was a millwright at Dofasco, and it was through his hard work and passionate commitment that our family prospered, and that I, with my brothers and sister, were able to build lives founded on security and stability. In fact, Mr. Speaker, my sister, my brothers, my mother, and I all worked in the steel industry. While Dofasco was never unionized, it benefited from what other unions in Hamilton attained. The hard-won achievements of unionized labor set an example for my father's employer to give its workers comparable rights, safety, and wages. This is but one very personal example of how unions, directly and indirectly, have improved the lives of Hamiltonians. When conditions are at their best, unions, employers, and government work together to build safe, prosperous, and stable communities, Mr. Speaker. It is this balance that Bill C-4 seeks to reestablish. This bill sets right that which was skewed by Bills C-377 and C-525. Indeed, Hamilton is a city whose history is closely connected to the labour movement. It was in Hamilton that the movement for the 9-hour workday in Canada was started. It was in Hamilton that in 1920, Katie McVicker and Mary McNabb, members of the Shoe Workers and the Knights of Labour, fought for the rights of women to join the labour force and to be respected. It was in Hamilton in 1935 that steelworkers organized a strike. Their employer didn't accede to their demands. However, a greater victory was achieved. The union expanded to include all workers, regardless of skill or nationality. That was progress, Mr. Speaker. These are the footings of the middle class in Hamilton, strong, built of cement and steel and hard work, wrought by the hands of people who believed in themselves and in one another. Unions have been creating conditions where individual workers can be resourceful, innovative, and contribute to an employer's intellectual capital. That's good for workers and for business, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has made a commitment to restore a fair, balanced approach to labour relations in this country. This will be a welcome relief from the previous government's approach, where labour and employers were pushed apart by legislation aimed at dividing and separating, rather than creating a healthy balance between worker and employer. One only needs to look at Hamilton to see how a city can be built up through labour success and ravaged when industry declines. Mr. Speaker, even former Conservative Senator Hugh Segal criticized Bill C-377, stating that this will actually worsen labour relations in Canada, slow economic development, and upend the balance between free collective bargaining, capital investment, and return, which are vital to a strong, free, mixed market economy. As a Conservative, I oppose the upending of this balance. Mr. Speaker, there's no need for Bill C-377. We already have the legislation in place to ensure that unions are financially accountable to their members. All of this is referred to in the Canada Labour Code. The needless red tape created by Bill C-377 creates an unfair playing field where unions could be disadvantaged during collective bargaining. We believe in fairness for both parties during collective bargaining, Mr. Speaker, and feel that tilting the game in favour of one party is an affront to the ancient principles of fairness upon which Canadian democracy is founded. The introduction of Bill C-377 in the House of Commons was an affront to Hamilton's working people. It was a bill designed to solve a problem that didn't exist. No one I know in Hamilton, West-Ancaster-Dundas ever told me that they clamored for the far-reaching and personal information this legislation was designed to uncover. Mr. Speaker, why was the last government interested in the private personal information of union members? The Income Tax Act protects taxpayers from revealing their personal financial information, but Bill C-377 reversed those protections and would force the disclosure of people's personal information to the general public. That, Mr. Speaker, is one of the reasons for which we are repealing this unnecessary and mean-spirited bill. Unions have an important role to play, Mr. Speaker. This repeal allows the unions to continue to focus on finding their members work in this challenging economy, rather than focusing on mountains of unnecessary filings to the CRA. Unions are democratic organizations and are accountable to their members, Mr. Speaker. If members don't like what unions are doing with their money, those members can vote their leaders out. In fact, Bill C-377 requires that labour organizations disclose information that no other organization is required to disclose. That isn't fair treatment. Mr. Speaker, there's been some discussion in the House about how other countries in the world require disclosure. Let us consider some of the facts. I believe one example of France was raised. However, in that country, Mr. Speaker, not only do the unions report, but the employers report too. In the United States, legislation similar to C-377 has existed for a number of years, but one could argue that it has done little to further the cause of transparency and accountability. Having discussed Bill C-377, allow me to briefly consider the ramifications of Bill C-525. Mr. Speaker, both the federally regulated Employers Transportation and Communications and the Canadian Labour Force have argued that Bill C-525 establishes a dangerous precedent for labour relations law reform in Canada. Traditionally in Canada, any amendments to labour relations law have been arrived at through tripartite consultation between employer, labour, and government. This tripartite consultation has been considered essential by stakeholders to the maintenance of a labour-employer balance. Mr. Speaker, Bill C-525 was introduced as a private member's bill, and private members' bills are outside the traditional tripartite process. The tripartite process encourages balance between labour and employers, but the previous government chose to use a backdoor to pass their legislation instead. Mr. Speaker, this demonstrates a clear, utter disregard for the previous government for Canada's democratic tradition in labour relations law. Bill C-525 is also an anti-union bill. More specifically, by requiring a secret ballot vote, Bill 525 adds an unnecessary layer to the process of union formation. Bill C-525 makes it more difficult for employees to unionize and easier for a bargaining agent to be decertified. As I have already said, Mr. Speaker, organized labour has provided stability and security to workers. To impede unionization is to hold workers back by making them fearful of being thrown into precarious working conditions. This makes people focus on the short term. It makes them anxious and tentative rather than open and confident. Hamilton and Canada were built by proud, confident workers, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I came to Ottawa to represent a city that grew out of the fires of industry through hard work, sacrifice, and care for each other. When Hamilton was most productive, it was because labour, employers, and government working to create a safe, stable, and prosperous city where people could innovate and create from a place of relative security. This collaboration depends on a balance between labour and employers, which was upset by the ideology of anti-union agenda of the previous government. Bill C-4 is a positive step toward righting the balance between labour and employers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.